Hey, I'm Max and today I will show you how to optimize your meshes for game dev in Blender while keeping some details. The most important thing for game dev meshes is that they have as little triangles as possible. The more triangles, the more time it will take for the GPU to render, so the lower FPS your game will have. Okay, so you can see here I have a rock mesh, but it has 64,000 triangles. That is way too much. Most of these triangles are in those cracks and claw marks. If you want to see how to make meshes with different areas of details, and with cool textures like this one, check out my previous video. For game dev, I don't want 64,000 triangles, but I still want to keep some details in those marks and claws. First, I duplicate my rock to keep the iPoly version for later, and hide it using the eye. Then I select my copy, go into modifiers and add a Decimate modifier. The lower you put the ratio, the more triangles will be removed, but the more details your mesh will lose. Try to reduce it as much as possible without making your mesh look too bad. Then you can apply it. My rock now only has 1,200 triangles, but those claws and the cracks now look very simple. To keep some of the details from the iPoly version without increasing our poly count, we need to use a normal map. I will link in the description a Blender add-on that I found that simplifies the process a lot. Once you install that and activate the add-on, you can open the menu with the N key. There you simply have to select the iPoly and the low poly mesh. Set your extrusion, which is basically how close or far from the low poly mesh you want to take details on the high poly. So if you put it too low, it will miss some details that are higher than what you set, like a big bump. But if you put it too high, then the small details will be too small and barely noticeable. For my rock, I set it to 0.01 and it was pretty good. When you hit bake, it will take a bit of time, then it will create and apply for you a normal map, which should be made with the shades of blue and purple. Here is the 64,000 triangles rock. Here is the 1,200 triangles rock with the normal map. And here it is again without the normal map. So you can see the normal map makes it seem a lot higher quality than it actually is. If you use higher resolution on the normal map, I'm sure you can get even more details. Also, fun fact, if you display the normal map as the texture map, you can see where it affects the mesh. So using only Decimate and normal maps, we were able to go from a high poly 64,000 triangles to a low poly 1,200 triangles and keep most of the details. Going from high poly to low poly works, but sometimes using Decimate can create some things you don't want. And it can overall make your mesh look pretty bad since it's not always going to cut where you want it. So an even better way to do this is to do the opposite, going from low poly to high poly and then bake the details. For example, here I made a simple 2 cube shape which is just 28 triangles. Then I duplicate it and hide the low poly version. I go into sculpting on the high poly version, and using the din topo sculpting, I add cracks and other details that I want. This makes my mesh go up to 56,000 triangles. Using the same process of unwrapping the UV, then using the add-on to bake the map, I was able to bake the details onto the low poly version. The result is really good. I get the details like cracks from the 56,000 triangles mesh, but using a mesh of only 28 triangles. So it will have nearly no render time in game, but it still looks very good. The details on the normal map will also react to lights in game, making them a lot more realistic than a texture. Speaking of textures, they are the third way to make your mesh have details while being optimized. The back of my model here is just a boring flat plane right now. A good way to make meshes more interesting is to draw textures on it using random noise, rust marks, damage spots, claws, etc. This will make your mesh a lot more interesting than just a flat color, but it will add nearly no render cost. So here I just made a random texture by drawing some noise with the nature brush, and then some claws marks and other marks on the side. If you want to see more, again check out my other video on how to make interesting meshes. Now if I open Unreal Engine, I can import my mesh and you can see it looks very bad because it's just a simple 28 triangles mesh. Then if I import my texture and set it into my material, it already looks a lot better even though it's the same amount of triangles. You can still see, however, that it's very low poly from the sharp edges and these simple shapes. So I import my normal map and add it to the material, and just like that, the mesh now looks a lot better. You can see light and shadow areas in the cracks. Since it's just a map, if you get really close you can see the cracks are not real because the whole surface is flat from the side, but from a distance it looks just like the 56,000 triangle version would look, with the very detailed cracks and lights and shadows, except you could use thousands of this because it's just 28 triangles, but you can only use a few 56,000 triangle versions without lagging. So the normal maps and textures are very powerful for creating details at nearly no cost, since it doesn't actually add any triangles to your mesh, but only puts something onto it, either a texture or a normal map to reflect the light differently. So it costs nearly nothing to display and adds a lot of details. So make sure to use them if you want to have an interesting looking game that doesn't lag.